Yeah, like I said, filthy rotten rich.
Okay.
In the mid-1830s, the price of flour soared, and we see many of the early millers building mansions. There are two in particular in the Third Ward that still survive today. One is the house of miller owner Harvey Ely, built in 1837. Since 1920, this fine old home has been the headquarters of the Daughters of the American Revolution, a Arundecoit chapter. The mansion is located on Troop Street in Cornhill. And this is the Campbell Willetsey House. Originally the home of mill owner Benjamin Campbell, this grand old home was built in 1836. From 1939 to 2010, the mansion was owned and operated by the Landmark Society as a house museum. It has since become private residence. The mansion is very prominent on the south side of 490 as you cross the Genesee River. These grand houses brought into Rochester a whole new lifestyle, surrounded by the new money. The in-fashion architecture of the 1830s was Greek Revival. The parlors were rooms reserved for reading, drawing, music, games, conversation. The new money of Rochester provided much more leisure time. In 1820, a young Jonathan Child moved to Rochester and opened a store at the Four Corners. When the Erie Canal was completed, Child operated a fleet of canal boats and his own harbor, which was called Child's Basin, which was one of the most active in Rochester. It was located on the north side of the canal at the west end of the aqueduct. This became the busiest Rochester Canal harbor. For those of you that are familiar with downtown Rochester, Child's Basin is right where Constellation Brand has their new building, which used to be Lawyers Co-op, okay, right in there. It's on the north side of the canal, because remember, Broad Street is the canal, okay? And Broad Street's been elevated a number of times. Well, it's been elevated from the lowest level. So when you look at it, especially if you come and visit me at Rundell, I'll show you one of the windows that you can see, and you see the original of those 52-foot arches. What they did was in 1918, when they moved the canal to cross the Genesee River, they moved it to cross it in Genesee Valley Park. They had this beautiful flat. What are we going to do with it? It crosses the river. Oh, I know what we'll do. We'll put rails on it, and that's going to become our subway. So from 1919 to 1956, that was where our subway was. But then in 1956, we were falling in love with the automobile, we were falling in love with the suburbs. The subway was losing money like crazy, so they did away with it, but they still had this flat land. So what are they going to do? They took up the rails, and now on the aqueduct, what they did was they put in another set of arches, and then on the top of that second arch, they put a ceiling on it, and that ceiling is Broad Street. The other part of it is Route 490 as you come into Rochester from the east. You can see remnants of it when you come in 490 or go out 490. When you're by Culver Road, you're going to see part of the lock that was there. The original wall is still there. That big pond that they call Lake Riley in Cobbs Hill Park, that's the remainder of what used to be called the Eastern Wide Waters. Because, as you're going to see in a minute, where the canal crossed the Genesee River at the aqueduct, it was a very, very tight turn. In fact, they had this, it used to be a 90-degree turn. But when they made it bigger, for these bigger boats, what they had to do was the boats had to wait down in the eastern wide waters and line up so that they could go through the aqueduct. And the aqueduct wasn't wide enough for these big monster boats to go side by side. So they took turns going back and forth. That was one of the reasons why we just talked a few minutes ago about how the different boats going in different directions left at different times. Again, it was traffic management. And Jonathan Child became filthy, rotten rich also. In June 1834, the first Rochester City Council, because 1834, now we are a city, it selected Jonathan Child to be the first mayor. Child built a mansion on Washington Street in Rochester, and using some of his canal boats, he was looking into the future. Now using his canal boats, he was one of the first ones that started bringing coal into Rochester, because coal is going to fuel the Industrial Revolution. But as I mentioned earlier, mills created more demand for goods among wealthier farmers and other people in Rochester, including the mill owners themselves. Store proprietors had their opportunity for wealth as well. One such store owner was Silas O. Smith, who came from Massachusetts in 1809 and set up a store at Hanford's Landing, as you can see on the left-hand side. And Hanford's Landing is about where Kodak Park is today. But in 1817, when he learned that the Erie Canal was planned and it would run through Nathaniel Rochester's settlement, he moved his store to the four corners of Main and State Street. This photograph you see here is the so-called Smith Block that contained Silas Smith's store. And the building lasted a long time. As you can see,
Isn't it the tower, I can't think of the name of it, the Towers Building or whatever?
The Powers Building.
Powers Building.
Powers Building.
In the back.
There's a bank building on this corner right now. But it was there for the longest time. As you can see, they rented Kodak cameras from there. It was there for a while because he made a lot of money and could afford a very fine built building. And guess what? He became filthy rotten rich. This is the mansion that Silas Smith built between 1838 and 1841, and it was at the edge of the woods. Thus, he named it Woodside. Its present address is 485 East Avenue, and it's built in the Georgian Revival style. All in all, by 1841, right as all those mansions were being built, Rochester had become a very urban place, much less like the country town it seemed to be only a decade earlier. This growth trend would continue well into the 1840s and 1850s. Here we have an 1841 print looking west on Main Street, just towards the Four Corners. Note that the scene is almost entirely urban, and it seems to stretch endlessly. But on one hand, urbanization was a great draw for skilled laborers. In the late 1820s, over half of the adult men in Rochester were skilled artisans, most of them engaged in turning local raw materials into finished goods for sale back to the countrysides, such as guns, nails, shoes, hats, woolen cloth, wagons, farm tools. Because why? They could use the water power to drive the machines that made those goods. Wheat was milled into flour and distilled into whiskey in the city. Logs were transformed into lumber, barrels, furniture, houses. Livestock produced salt meat, shoes, harnesses, and other leather goods. But on the other hand, not everyone in Rochester was rich or even middle class. Far from it. Rochester became a magnet for transients. And what I mean is young single males seeking work and having no attachments. This population was huge starting in the 1820s as laborers poured into Rochester to work on the canal and the related industries such as boat building, barrel making, and building the city itself. By one estimate, over 100 people moved in and out of Rochester every day in the 1820s. Rochester had been a face-to-face society, but that changed rapidly. In 1820, most Rochesterians worked, played, and slept in the same place. There were no separate residential and commercial zones, and no residential zones characterized by social class, such as the rich area or the poor section of town, and so forth. In 1820, the norm was for wage earners to live and work in the same place, and that place was right at the home with the master craftsman and his family. But after 1825, all this changed. The influx of large number of casual workers in this fast-growing town led to the segregation of masters and those workers. Workers formed their own neighborhoods and were no longer supervised daily by the master class. Social tensions between the two groups began to grow because, just to give one example, Rochester had been a town with a very active temperance movement. Most of the master craftsmen were church-going temperance advocates. Casual laborers, on the other hand, after a hard day's work, enjoyed a few beers at the end of the day, and sometimes that led to trouble. But not all ended up in jail, of course, but many did spend the occasional night there as a result of public drunkenness, fighting, petty theft, etc. The original jail in Rochesterville was just a log structure, which quickly was determined to be way too small for the booming village. The new jail was a stone structure 60 feet by 40 feet, featuring 2 tiers of cells in the center of the building. Each cell was 4 by 8 by 7 and were placed back to back. The third floor had rooms for women and children inmates. The new jail was completed in 1832 at a cost of $12,500. The Erie Canal, as the interstate of its time, transported more than people and products. The canal was the conduit of the times. In the summer of 1832, a cholera epidemic hit Rochester, and it arrived via the canal. On July 12th, a packet boat passenger died, and the next day, another passenger died. A week later, a canal boat pilot died of cholera, followed by 3 children on his boat the next day. All in all, a total of 388 cases of cholera were reported in 1832, with 121 deaths, all after the arrival of a sick packet boat passenger. Rochester, as a booming economic center, drew many looking for jobs. This constantly shifting population of young, unattached males raised concerns on the part of the merchants and master craftsmen who made up Rochester's stable and prosperous business class. In particular, Rochester's churchgoer proprietors, along with the members of the temperance movement, watched with growing anxiety the rise in drunkenness, absenteeism from work, street fighting, gambling, and prostitution. From the fall of 1830 to the early summer of 1831, the famous revivalist preacher Charles Grandison Finney was in Rochester. This occurred during the time period referred to as the Second Great Awakening. Finney delivered sermon after sermon, at least one a day and several on Sundays, in Rochester's Presbyterian churches, or really any other place he was asked to preach. Finney's explanation for Rochester's social ills was the failure of the town's most established church-going business and civic leaders to lead others to a moral life through persuasion and example. He urged the business, civic, and social leaders of Rochester to reform and return to God in a righteous way of life. Adding to the cultural anxiety of Rochester's pioneers was economic anxiety. The industry that made Rochester, flour milling, had reached its peak and no longer monopolized the trade along the Erie Canal. Rochester's growth and its linkage to other markets was not unique, but part of a national trend. So Rochesterians now had to work harder to keep up. This was worrisome because virtually every other business depended on it. It was a symbolic blow. Rochester milling had the same prominence nationally in that time period as Kodak had in our time period. Rochester had been called the young lion of the West. But people were moving further westward, giving birth to some fast-growing baby lions, places like Chicago and Cleveland and Cincinnati. Many of Rochester's pioneer generation were leaving for these places. The Erie Canal was a huge and immediate success as a transportation artery. Its success prompted imitation. There was a rash of nationwide canal building which followed. The Erie Canal greatly lowered the cost of shipping between the Midwest and the Northeast, bringing much lower food costs to eastern cities and allowing the East to economically ship machinery and manufactured goods to the Midwest. The canal also made an immense contribution to the wealth and importance of Rochester, New York City, Buffalo, and all of New York State. Its impact went much further, increasing trade throughout the nation by opening eastern and overseas markets to Western farm products by enabling migration to the West. Within 15 years of the canal's opening, New York City was the busiest port in America, moving tonnages greater than Boston, Baltimore, and New Orleans combined. In all of this canal traffic, the people, the products, the ideas, the innovations, all had to pass through Rochester. Rochester changed drastically in a mere 35 or so years, just really about one generation. From an insignificant settlement along the falls to a booming economic center based at the crossroads of the Erie Canal and the Genesee River, Rochester changed economically as well as demographically. As Rochester changed from a milling center to a manufacturing center, the people who filled the jobs changed as well. Rochester became a destination city for people looking to make a new start. The city was filling up not only with European immigrants, but our African American population started to grow and be prosperous. The 1850s saw Frederick Douglass set up his newspaper in Rochester. Rochester had become a strategic part of the Underground Railroad as runaway slaves made their way to freedom in Canada. Rochester changed just as the rest of the country changed in the mid-19th century. As the young lion of the West, Rochester played a vital part in the development of the young nation in the early 19th century. But a storm was brewing in the nation in the mid-1800s, and Rochester would again play a vital role. But that's another chapter in the history of Rochester. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
he had been mayor of New York City at least twice, maybe 3 times. And was his major impetus at the beginning to bring more trade to New York City?
It was to bring more trade to New York City, but yeah, but he had, his eyes were on bigger goals to be governor.
And he had a hard time with that convincing the legislature at first, I think.
Well, he was a genius. And I'll tell you why he was genius, because he had lots and lots of opposition to this. It was called Clinton's ditch, Clinton's folly. They thought he had fallen down and hit his head 1,000 times. So when he did push it through, and he pushed it through promoting what? Money. Everyone's going to make money on this, just give it a chance. However, he knew that every legislation session had to renew money to build it. So he didn't want to build it out of either end because it would only go so far an end, right? You could use it from the Ohio, from the Hudson to somewhere, or from Lake Erie to somewhere. He was a genius. He started it in the middle. He started it in the middle, so that means that you had to complete it to make it an economic viable thing to get your money back. So he started it in the middle, and he went either way to get it built. In fact, the canal ended for about a year over here in Brockport. Brockport was the terminus of the canal, and then the next legislative session, they got the money and they went farther west with it. So it was very political, but it was, he laughed all the way to the bank, and he's probably still laughing in his grave, because it made so much money. They thought that it was going to take 25 years to pay back the investment. They made it back in 6.5 years. It was a huge success. That's why it prompted all of this canal building in the Midwest, because the Midwest has lots of rivers. So what they did was they connected the rivers using canals. So we are still benefiting from this idea of the canal going through New York State, because the next time you are on the thruway, and let's say you're going towards Albany, you're going to be able to see the 3 major transportation modes that just changed everything over our history. You're going to see, if you're on the thruway going towards Albany, on the far left you're going to see the canal. Well, the canals are great, but you can't use them in the winter. They freeze. But it's flat land right next to it, so what are you going to put right next to it? Railroads, because you can use railroads 365, 24/7. So they did. So then what happens when railroads, you only can go where the tracks are, and cars come, so now they built the thruway there, the interstate right there, so you have interstate, railroad, canal, the 3 great means of transportation right next to each other. So Clinton he and his engineers were geniuses 200 years into the future. Yes?
I noticed when you were talking about the early canal companies that there were always horses. How many horses? No mules. Is that a myth about mules?
No, there were mules too. This is funny. Horses were worth more than mules. So they would list their stables by how many horses they had. Mules were, let's say, horses were the Cadillacs, mules were the Chevys. So yes, there were both, horses and mules. And a lot of times they just mixed them in. Yes?
When was the canal first widened?
1862.
1860.
It was widened and deepened because the boats were getting too big. The demand was too much. The canal was just full of boats out of the time because of the demand. Because in 1862, we're in the middle of the Civil War. So what we need is we have to feed the Union Army. We're going to feed the Union Army by all the grain we're growing in the Midwest. So there was a need for it. It was a wartime need. So 1862, that's on one of the slides, on the original canal, They only went up to 95 feet, and then they had the big monsters after they got bigger in 1862. Yes, sir.
Years ago, they called it Barge Canal. When did they change the name from Erie to Barge, and then somewhere along the line they changed it back to Erie?
It's interesting, yes, because what they did was, because it fell out of favor, let's say, with the love affair of the automobile and semi-tractor trailer trucks, that they really wanted to get more commercial traffic on it. So they called it the Barge Canal to promote barge traffic on it. And then when they realized and they saw what they had, this historic waterway, and with the rise of the middle class along these canal towns. What do you see when you go along these canal towns? You see all the boats. The pleasure boats. So what they saw was there was a way that they could reestablish use of this, because the New York State has the Canal Authority, and that is your tax dollars working. So what they want to do is they wanted to be able to maximize the use of it. So they went back and they renamed it the Erie Canal. But today, those terms are interchangeable.
When you talked to the way stations, you said the amount they were charged varied based upon the goods, and you even mentioned politics.
Yes.
How is that so?
Because whoever was in power at the time had the right to charge, to develop the rates. So let's say one party's in power and the other party is in power here in Rochester, you're going to nail them over here. Politics, just like politics today. So it was, and a lot of it too would be because the rates were by the product. So if you were a politician and you had an investment in, let's say, a manufacturing firm, you're going to try to get your manufactured goods at the lowest cost transportation as possible. So you're going to promote that at the cost of somebody else's product. Yes, ma'am.
What was the major labor force that built the canal?
Irish immigrants. There's been some scholarly work lately, and I forgot the name of the book. As soon as I get in my car, I'll remember it. But what it is, it's a study of Irish immigrants. They're Catholic, okay? So what happens is there were priests following the construction of the canal, and they kept records. So there's been scholarly research into this on how and the economic and social implications of that community of young men, because they would come from Ireland, and sometimes they would come by the young men would come by themselves and send for their families, or they would come to New York City and then leave their families in New York City, usually with other relatives, and then they would go and work on the canal and then send money to bring them back up. So it was very common for these canal workers to work along, and they're saying, hey, holy smokes, I was starving to death in Ireland. As an Irishman, I am not allowed to own land in Ireland, because that was what the British said, because the British used Ireland as a colony. If you were Catholic Irish, you could not own land. Holy smokes, here in Spencerport, I can go out and I can buy land, and it's cheap, and they did.
Flower City, I'm relatively new to the area, like 2 years, and the only thing I've ever seen associated was an image of a flower, not grain.
Right. That happened in the late 19th century when Rochester became the Flower City, Flower, because per capita we had the largest nursery stock industry in the world. Next time you go to Highland Park used to be the nursery for Ellwanger and Berry. Ellwanger and Berry was the world's largest nursery stock company in the world. They ship things everywhere in the world. So if you look at the city logo has both symbols of flower, F-L-O-U-R, F-L-O-W-E-R, because the city logo is an imprint of a lilac blossom with a water wheel imposed on it. So it's kind of both of them. And then after that happened, we became the image city because we were Kodak City. So, Rochester, over its history, we have changed our way, we've changed our demographics, we've changed our economy, we've always reinvented ourselves, and now with the demise of Kodak and Xerox and Bausch and Lomb, well, the people of Rochester will reinvent themselves into something else, and we'll go on to doing something else. Yes, sir.
One more question. The Erie Canal, when it went through Rochester, changed its course at one time, as I understand, and didn't it go behind the Spring House or Monroe Restaurant?
It was right behind the Spring House in Monroe, yes, and that was after 1862.
Then there's another lot up by Wegmans on Monroe Avenue. You go up into Wegmans parking lot, with the ruins of an old lot.
Yeah, there were 83 locks, and we don't notice it because we do it every day, but the Rochester area is hilly, and water always seeks its own level, so if it goes up any bit, you have to get a lock. So it's remarkable that we had so many locks locally. I mean, you can go out to Pittsburgh, lock 32 right now, and watch an operating lock. So yeah, and it's amazing that technology was developed as they did it. You really want to see something unique, go out to Lockport and look at the 5 locks.
In there.
Yeah, amazing. All dug by hand. Yeah, so. Okay, thank you very much, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. We have a 50-50 drawing, so we're going to need your help with that, if you wouldn't mind. I figure out how to open the bulb. Reach in there and pick a winner for
I'm going to
us.
pick the winner.
There's $44.50 in the pot. The last 3 digits will
No,
go.
the last 3 digits, 286.
286.
286.
Well, you will be if you win it. What? 286. There he is. Tom Henyon's got it, or Eileen does. All righty. I'm going to leave this here. We've got a few books up front that Shirley Cox Houston had written on the Erie Canal, so you're